Before we dive into this episode, we wanted to remind our listeners of the contest we launched to wrap up our first year of episodes. We want to showcase the up-and-coming ideas in the world of planning and design that will hopefully gain traction and make their way back onto our podcast as a book review episode. Are you going to be the person who comes up with a groundbreaking idea like new urbanism or form-based code? For more information on the contest, the deadlines, and the prizes in the two categories, student and practicing professional, head to bookedonplanning.com/contest. This is Booked on Planning, a bi-weekly podcast that breaks down the world we live in by paging through current and classic books. I'm Steph Rouse. I'm joined today by Gracen Johnson to talk about Sir Peter Hall's book, Cities of Tomorrow. Hall was a professor of planning at the Bartlett School of Architecture, Building, Environmental Design and Planning at University College London, and director of the Institute of Community Studies. Hall was a well-regarded planner who passed away in 2014 at the age of 82, having published, edited, and wrote chapters in nearly 30 books. Gracen, thanks for joining me today to talk about Cities of Tomorrow and give your insight as a fellow fan of the book.
Thanks, Stephanie.
In looking at ways to record this episode without the author, I came across an article that you had written for Strong Towns a few years back and thought it was really intriguing, the insights that you had. Can you give our listeners a quick summary of your background and how you've interacted in the world of planning and design?
Sure. Thank you so much for having me here. I have to say this is one of the more interesting requests I've ever had, is to talk about one of my favorite planning textbooks. But yeah, I did love this textbook, and I got into it in my master's degree, which was in England. And, you know, Peter Hall is much more well known in England as sort of like a planning scholar. And so there were a few chapters that were assigned to me, and I just remember loving the book. And so I read it again after. But my educational background is in planning, and particularly studying what to do with places that are experiencing decline from a government level, what kind of economic policies and planning theories and approaches can help places stabilize or revitalize. So that was the focus of my degree. And then after that, I came back to Canada. I'm Canadian. And I started trying to put this sort of thing into practice and understanding what it would look like to do sort of infill in places that were struggling, and how neighborhoods can help kind of redevelop themselves, like a locally driven grassroots effort. And so that led me to get involved with an organization called Strong Towns. And then ultimately I ended up co-founding another organization called the Incremental Development Alliance. All of those that were focused on just kind of helping communities in whatever way we could to fill in the gaps and take small steps, the incremental steps, towards a stronger neighborhood. And then just a year and a half ago, I decided to switch my focus back to Canada, and I now work with our federal housing agency.
That's a really interesting background. And I think the work you were doing with the incremental development is becoming such a big part of the field today and super important.
It is very cool to see places, even just like the White House, talking about the kinds of things that we had been working on for a long time. And it is very, very interesting just seeing that kind of come into the zeitgeist for everybody.
So jumping into the book, Hall starts off with a very thorough explanation of how the book is structured and what to expect in reading it. And he even was talking about how it's really hard to pigeonhole all of the history of planning into a chronological or a topic-based setup. So it's sometimes can be a little bit hard to read and follow along because you keep jumping back and forth in the timeline. But he talks about how planning and the problems of the city are synonymous, merging into economic sociology and politics of cities, which are very reflective of their time. He says, quote, historical actors do perform in response to the world they find themselves in, and in particular to the problems that they confront in that world. And the book is really focused on late 19th and early 20th centuries, but those observations, I think, can really fit into any time period. We like to think of planners as being ahead of trends and guiding growth, but really, in my experience, we tend to be very reactive and kind of following along with this quote of solving the problems that we're faced with at that time. And I'm curious what your experience has been.
I think the reason that I like this book so much is it really reflects the reality of the kind of mess that's in your head in the planning world now. So as you said, it's not chronological. I mean, it's kind of chronological, but there's all of these competing theories that keep reoccurring. And I think that that is a really interesting way of seeing it, where there's kind of these recurring themes or these lines of thought and approaches that planners have taken now I realize through reading this book since, hundreds of years ago. And they all kind of coexist, and they're all still competing with each other. And so that's how I would look at it. Is I don't think that things are necessarily going to change. Like there will be like foresight where planners are going to come up with some like brand new way of approaching things. It's just that like through different circumstances and trends and political situations, certain themes or certain narratives are going to take more of a spotlight. And sometimes it's because they have someone who is I don't want to say like the ego behind it. Sometimes it is a lot of ego, but there's sometimes a proponent of a particular theory that gets a lot of traction. And that may be what makes it the trend of the day. And sometimes it's driven by the economics or the political situation. But yeah, that's kind of what I reacted to with this book. It was just incredibly humbling to see how many things that I have thought throughout my life or, ideas that I've thought that I've had that I could then kind of plant in history and different discoveries in different situations and notice that, nothing is really new in this world. It's just, when do we call upon particular responses?
Yeah, it did definitely feel that way for me. Like the saying that there's no new stories, that everything is just a version of something in the past. And you start to see that with the very community-driven approach to doing planning and development that we're seeing now, and how that was already a trend several decades ago.
Yeah.
It's very interesting.
Yeah. And I also kept on reading through this and thinking, oh, that's where we're at now, or where we're doing that again, or we're doing that again. And what I found was really interesting is every chapter, even though it's going through a different theme, in every chapter, you can see an element of, oh, we're doing that again. Even for something as like distinct as the City Beautiful movement, there's pieces of that you can kind of plant in our everyday conversation now, where, you'll hear about a project where they are choosing to kind of like raise a neighborhood in order to build an arena or something like that. And it's the same kind of thinking, or it sort of stems from the same place. Yeah, I found that really, really cool. I love history books to begin with, and this one being history about the very niche and nerdy world that I inhabit has been a favorite. And he's also just a really fun author. Like he's always just chirping different people in the past. Like he really goes off on them. He pulls no punches, and it's very funny.
Yes, no, I agree. He's very candid about it and makes it interesting. And I found it interesting, this different areas of history that he focused on. Some got 3 or 4 chapters. Others, like talking about the Burnham Plan for Chicago, had a couple paragraphs. And at least in my experience, like that Burnham Plan for Chicago is such a great document and a foundation for planning in America. And really, it wasn't as important when you read the full history of how everything started and got going.
Yeah, well, and that one was cool too, because I think part of that is he was writing from living in the UK, right? And so there's probably a difference in terms of what we absorb through planning history living in North America versus him witnessing that. And he actually connected that whole movement to like Nazi Germany, which was not a connection I would have made, right? Yeah. But he's drawing different connections of being like, oh, here was another tyrant that wanted to do this. And I was like, oh, that's not how I thought of Daniel Burnham's Make No Small Plans. But then I'm like, okay, well, I can see where he's going of this approach or this vision that Nazi Germany had for Berlin, apparently, that didn't come to fruition. But I think that that's part of it, is seeing the history also from someone who is not American, or, in my case, not Canadian.
It was very interesting seeing the parallels between the US version and the UK version of planning and its development and how things got done. And it almost felt in a broad way that UK planning got more accomplished. There just seemed to be more, especially in the housing chapters, talking about constructing new housing and providing affordable housing, that in the US, we kind of left it to the developers, didn't really get involved, and not as much got done. But in the UK, there was more of a top-down approach, which at least today, it's top-down is a bad approach, but it seemed to get more done back then.
Yeah, it is interesting looking at the UK history and how much the garden city movement and those ideas really took root there. And what you see throughout the whole book, and I think that anyone that works in the planning world can appreciate this, is, there are very idealistic visions that people have for what something's going to look like, and what ends up happening on the ground is some kind of like Frankenstein half measure of it. And in the UK, you do see the new towns, and you see sort of the experimentation with garden cities. And there is such a strong emphasis on green belts and protecting the countryside, and the sort of national level involvement in city building and planning. And by comparison, it kind of feels like America and Canada are this freewheeling, just do what you want, which is not the case at all. Like, we have zoning here, and that's not a thing in the UK. So yeah, I do find the comparison really, really helpful. It's just always good to get out of your local context and understand that cities can be built in different ways, and housing can be supported in different ways in different countries.
That was another interesting conversation on a different episode we did with Zoned in the USA, the author who wrote that book. And just zoning is something that as planners, that's how in the US all of our designs are done, and it's a foundation of our field. And hearing that it's not that way everywhere, I was kind of surprised when I read that book.
It took me so long to wrap my head around it, because I did my planning degree in the UK, and like zoning didn't come up. It just didn't come up. And the approach there is, if you want to develop something, you basically have to ask permission for everything that you build. And they have principals, and they have these local authorities that will grant you that permission. But it was just a completely different concept. And no one had explained to me like, oh, it's completely different back in Canada, back in the US. And so it took me a long time to actually piece together, like, this is not the way that everybody does things. It's just so much a part of our parlance and planning that, like, yeah, there's places that exist without zoning.
Yeah. And now we're kind of evolving, some communities at least are evolving a little bit away from strict zoning and going to more form-based codes, where it's less about uses and their locations, and it's a little more flexible, I guess.
And of course, in other places that don't have zoning, they're always kind of looking around the world and saying, oh, could we use zoning? Would zoning make things better for us? Would zoning solve our problems? And that's also the piece that you see in this book, is there's like movements and counter movements in every single piece of it. And it's constantly a debate. And the debate is always around, I think you put it really well in your notes, around the city is kind of considered this problem. And like planning is trying to solve the problem of the city. And so much of the planning theories that you see through history are also deeply anti-urban, which I found really interesting looking at that. There's like a lot of sort of anarchist and top-down planning theories and trends that are about like decongesting the city. And it's about creating these idealistic places that are in the countryside. And, oh, like we would be so much better if we were just in the countryside. And you see that through so many different eras in this book that he's talking about, this like constant thread of the city being the problem.
I know that was very interesting that the origins of city planning were based on that concept of getting everyone out of the cities and decreasing the congestion and removing the blight in the slums. And it was pushing everyone out to give them fresh air. And it makes sense when that description in the first couple chapters and the quotes from actual surveys of these kind of slum areas, both in London and New York at the times in the late 1800s, of just how awful the conditions were and how cramped everyone was. So it made sense to decongest and spread people out. But then there was almost an immediate reaction of, no, we're doing too much of this. We're sprawling everywhere. And it was really interesting to see, like, sprawl to me was a debate in like the 50s and 60s, not in the 20s and 30s. And the architects were really against this sprawling movement that was a reaction to the poor housing conditions.
Totally. Yeah. And that was something that shocked me as well, is just seeing, we kind of like to treat ourselves as like enlightened now in this planning world of like, oh, well, we did it wrong before and now we've learned. And you look back through this, and at every stage, again, it was that debate. There was always a debate. At every single point, there were people that were anti-sprawl. Like at every single point, people were making the same arguments of like, this is a waste of resources, or this is going to be expensive commuting, or this is not accessible to everyone. Those critiques were always there. And yeah, I find that humbling as well, to really reflect on things that I assume to be true, or in kind of the theory of planning, sometimes we'll talk about things in a way that makes it sound like there is consensus on something, or we have landed on this place, and to recognize that no, it's probably the same arguments that are never going to resolve themselves, because this is not necessarily a resolvable. If the city is a problem, I don't think it's a resolvable one, you know?
Definitely, because everyone has their own views of what's acceptable and what makes a good quality of life. Not everyone agrees on that. So it's definitely a balance, I think, that planners have to play and have always had to play, because it seems like the planning group was always ebbing and flowing in public favor. At first, when they got going, they were given free rein, it seemed, to design cities and make decisions and had this very top-down authority. And then they fell out of favor, it seemed, in the early 1900s and didn't have a lot of support and weren't really doing work. And the architects had kind of taken back over. And then it kind of flipped again in the 60s. It was interesting reading how the profession kind of ebbed and flowed in the public's eyes.
Yeah. With trends in either thinking that things should be kind of community led, or things should be more business led, or thinking that things are so desperate that, the government needs to step in and do something. Yeah. All of that you can see playing out.
Going back to the conversation on garden cities versus garden suburbs. So we talked a little about how there was this argument against sprawl and suburban development, and London had been expanding out in this ribbon development pattern, and the architects were speaking out against it and were not in favor of the kind of cookie cutter designs that were being built at the time. And then the counter to that was Ebenezer Howard's Garden City. And it's interesting because there was only a few cases where a true garden city was actually built. The author talks about New Earswick being one that was designed by Parker and Unwin as a great city with natural features, communal garden space, and a calming effect. But what was interesting is almost all of the garden cities that we think of were really just garden suburbs. And it was this compromise between the suburb or a satellite city with the shell of the Howard Garden City idea. I remember reading about this as part of a chapter in an intro to planning course, the garden cities. And I don't know if I just forgot or didn't realize, but a big part of Howard's Garden City was this idea of a self-governing local welfare state. And he really struggled to get that funded or supported in England. So that was a big piece of his Garden City idea that never got realized.
Yeah, because we focus so much on the architectural vision for it and this idea, like the thing that you can picture, especially with the name, like Garden City evokes this picture in everybody's mind of this kind of grassy knoll, Shire-like environment where you can hop on the train and it's connected to London, but you've got your own little place. I remember reading that and thinking how much I'd missed out on by not getting the full history, that this was actually like slightly anarchic. It was like kind of this social engineering project that he had in mind for these communities. And I got to visit Letchworth when I was in England. And so I saw it. I saw one of these again, like everything's kind of a half completed Frankenstein version of what you had in mind. So I could picture what he was writing about in this textbook, where it was a struggle to recruit employers, if I recall correctly reading this, where it was not hard to sell people, as especially middle-class people, on this vision of, hey, like, let's get you a house and, it's going to be in this lovely place and there's going to be fences and thatch roofs, or it'll be sweet. And so the people were willing to move there. But in order to get the employers to move there, it was just a more difficult piece of the puzzle and didn't quite fit into like the utopia that Howard had in mind. And one of the things that I found so interesting as a theme throughout this, and like I think the first time it came up in the books was with this Garden City thing, was that it ended up being like a commuter situation where people did want to live there, but they still commuted to London for work. And so a lot of the money that was made in this whole enterprise was through the transportation system, not necessarily through the real estate itself. And that made me think of, oh my God, like that is like the suburbs here too. It's car companies. It's like, who is profiting from this decongestion of the city? So often it would be like the train line or the automobile industry, and the challenge of moving employers and moving particular like essential workers to a place where they didn't necessarily organically sprout up. It was just such an interesting and probably predictable outcome of that, but something that I hadn't really considered before. Like when we do our like SimCity version of planning, you can design a really beautiful place, but like so often through all these theories, they're neglecting like, where do people work? How do people make money? And that's a question I don't know that we've really solved yet.
Yeah, no, I would agree. And I found it really ironic that mass transit in the 1930s was part of the solution to creating these garden cities and reducing sprawl. Whereas like transportation of the 50s and 60s, as you mentioned, the auto industry really drove that, created problems with sprawl, and especially in the US that planners are now dealing with and trying to get whole communities, not just these residential neighborhoods where you have to commute an hour or so to get into the job centers.
Yeah. And so it's hard on the actual community. It's hard on the city, but like who has made bank on all of this? It's highway builders, it's automobile industry. Like there is profit to be made in this concept. And I also like, I want to be humble and not just poo-poo things, because a lot of people found a nice home that they love and that they were able to raise their kids in a much more comfortable environment by kind of decanting out into these other areas. And so, I'm not here to disrespect that, it provided a much better life for a lot of people. But from the perspective of like the city trying to solve its problems, it didn't necessarily work. It just kind of lined the pockets of people that do transportation.
Mm-hmm. Yeah. And I remember reading one account, I think it was one of the earlier suburbs, where a family had moved out and the housewife no longer had her community because she was out in a suburb and she'd moved away from the ability to walk to anything or talk with her neighbors, and wanted to go back to the poor housing quality that she had before just because she was more connected and had better access. But then there's others that have, the American dream, and they really thrived in that environment and enjoyed it.
That was a theme that came up often as well, that I noticed, is so often the planning industry falls into the trap of imposing kind of middle class values or their own sense of propriety or their own sense of their own values on the people, the residents of wherever they're planning or wherever they're kind of trying to come up with like a solution for, and having the humility to understand that, maybe people do have options and they're choosing one that you wouldn't choose personally. And it's not a bad thing for them, or, there are trade-offs that they're willing to make, and maybe living in a smaller space or living in an environment that you personally wouldn't want to live in is not something that you should deprive them the opportunity of. So that was something that I took from some of those earlier chapters, even when they were talking about, not that in any way I'm suggesting we go back to this, but when they're talking about responses to things like tenement housing and all of that, and how like public health got really, really involved, and you sort of have these institutional levels of health and safety and engineering that are going in there saying like, this is not okay. Like we need everything to change. And then unfortunately, it ends up displacing a ton of people. So it's like you had people that were living in horrible conditions, and now you have people that don't have anywhere to live. And so like the unintended consequences of trying to do the right thing or trying to clean things up, you see as like this recurring theme of like assuming, oh, this is unbearable conditions, and so we'll go and we'll change it. And then you end up displacing a lot of people, or as you said, like kind of removing some of those social constructs that like keep people secure and happy in their lives.
Yeah. And that's just another excellent example of how the trends just kept reoccurring. So we saw that in the tenement housing cleanup of the late 1800s, but we also saw it again in the 50s and 60s with urban renewal, where we thought we were coming in and fixing a problem, and it really was creating more issues and increasing inequities and displacing tons of families.
And some people probably had good intentions with that. And, it's probably important to recognize that some people did not have good intentions with that they were trying to clear out things that they thought were dragging down the city, or it's something that we still see. In the chapter on sweat equity, they kind of go into when things were handed over to, like, in particular, was talking about Patrick Geddes and his trip to India. And there was military engineers that were designing things, and they would end up designing a toilet for a house that was worth twice as much as the house. So they're trying to add like sanitation, but it's in a way that is like completely impractical for the people that are living there, and trying to find a way forward that is respectful and actually participatory for the people that will be using and inhabiting the things that are being planned seems to be important. But then I'm also reflecting that, okay, like this is me planting myself in a theory right now. I have now just situated myself in a particular planning theory that also has critics and also has all of that. So yeah, this book was a journey in that way.
Yeah. And going back to kind of the equity piece of it, you see little pieces of it where he doesn't really call it out, but just kind of frames the issue as it was in the day. And it wasn't until the very end of the book that he really addresses the issue of racism in America and some of the planning policies that were really quite racist, with HUD's funding mechanisms and redlining and other things like that. And there was one where, Robert Moses always gets this bad rap as the guy that just rammed highways through everywhere and destroyed communities. And it's always framed with Jane Jacobs as part of it, and this kind of battle between the two. And there was a section or a piece where he talked about how Robert Moses, one of his early projects in the 1920s, intentionally built bridges too low so buses couldn't get under them.
Yep.
Which meant that low-income residents couldn't go to the beach. That was just so shocking to me, how blatant of a decision.
That is exactly the highlight. I was thinking about, like, people being intentionally cruel about it. Yeah.
And then the author dives into the topic and starts his discussion of racism in America in the 20s and 30s, with the conditions of Blacks in America, and then the studies that were done throughout by both Black and white scholars and sociologists. And they all seem to blame unemployment and family disintegration and social disorganization for the crime and ghettos of the time in major urban cities. And it wasn't until the analysis of the riots in 1967 that any work was published on the true faults of the issues with inner cities, and decades of white racism being to blame for that. And there was an attempt made to integrate the Black underclass into the mainstream America, as the author put it, which is an approach we know that today was really missing the mark and failed to remove any of the inequities that are in our culture.
Yeah, he ends the book in this really interesting way. In this chapter, he's not specifically talking in racial terms. He calls the chapter The City of the Permanent Underclass. And he ends it just saying, like, even back in Victorian times, there's all this work that has been done, and all of these people throughout time that have been really trying to help and trying to make sure that, like, their neighbors can be lifted out of a poverty situation. And despite there being a lot of success in that, and many generations of people going from, being in really rough conditions to not being, and in different countries as well, his comment, like the way he closes this massive thing, is basically like, no matter how many people get moved out of poverty, it gets refilled. And I found that just like honestly, a very depressing way to end the book, because it felt like very biblical to me, where he's like, and the poor will always be with us. He did kind of set the whole book up for that, of, you have all of these kind of movements throughout time which are trying to identify, one, how do we, maybe I'm being too Pollyannish to say, like, how do we help the poor? He also talks about, so often, the motivation for this kind of thing in the past being fear from middle class and upper class people in the society, that there would be uprisings, there would be revolt, there would be, they're looking at these conditions and they're saying, oh my goodness, people are going to turn against us. And so I don't want to be Pollyannish about it, but I just found that really heartbreaking at the end, how he's, reflecting on all of the people that have actually had successes and have done good work and are identifying these problems and, like, coming up with responses to it. And he does have, like, a fairly optimistic view of planning as not a profession, but as like a service. And yet he ends it just saying, he says here's the sentence. He says, the abiding problem is why, despite all the massive intervening economic and social improvement, the underclass should appear so steadily to recruit new members to replace those that lost to it. To that question, research yet provides no answer. Here the story ended in 1988, and here it still ends. So that was close to the 1990s. Yeah, I don't know. I'm wondering how you felt about that conclusion to everything.
Yeah, no, I would agree. It was very bleak. And I think in the 30, 40 years since the book was originally published and where you left off, that we haven't made a ton of progress. It seems that we always have these new programs. I mean, there was the War on Poverty and some other programs that have come in place that just haven't solved the issue. It just always seems to be, again, that we lift some people out and then others move into poverty. And so it's always this kind of challenge.
I imagine that part of it is, what you sense with a lot of these movements in the past is that sometimes it felt like, as a reader, sometimes you'd be reading people's theories. And I think, Peter Hall kind of holds your hand in this because he is very critical. And there would be these theories on planning that kind of masquerade as trying to help people in need, but it doesn't really. Sometimes it's more about like people having a grand plan that they want to action, or again, with people who are afraid of revolt. And I think we still see a lot of that in the industry now, where, the way to move your project forward or to advance is to kind of like couch it in the terms of, well, this is helping marginalized people, or this is doing this and that. It just makes you really attuned to the fact that, like, so often in the past, theories and projects and policies have been done in that name and they have not necessarily hit the mark. And at the same time, there's like a lot of messiness to it where, things don't work out the way you want them to, but they do still help in some capacity, right? People are better off because of them, but it's still definitely not perfect. There was no perfection in this book. Every chapter was just like, well, this one kind of worked, but it also didn't.
Yeah, no, I think the garden cities are a good example of that. They were good for some people and they lifted the lower income class up and out, and they had their own home, smaller homes, but the designs of them were very cookie cutter and the same thing over and over again. Then it left a whole of the lowest poverty stricken residents living in slum conditions still and not being addressed. And I feel like there's an element of that today, that if we're going to do an affordable housing project, we skimp on any of the extra amenities or things that really make it a beautiful building or a place that you really want to live. We're restricted by budgets and trying to get projects built at an affordable level. But I think we sacrifice some of the more desirable amenities and features of a home that would make it more appealing to someone to live there.
And that comes up too, is just the expense of it, right? So many people have these visions that part of the reason they end up this kind of Frankenstein application of it is that it's so incredibly expensive to build housing and to maintain housing. And so many people throughout history have recognized, we want this to be beautiful, dignified. Like we want people to love these communities and feel like they can contribute to them and be proud of the place they live. And like, that's been part of the theory so often. And yet when it comes time for someone to actually pay for it, it's like, well, we can't afford to do that. They are so expensive that sometimes when you're reading through the history of it, it seems like the only things that kind of got built were built in this very tyrannical way. Like I think he was talking about, it was probably the chapter on City of Monuments. And I think he was talking about Soviet, like the City Beautiful movement being applied in Soviet Russia, and how it took it took that regime to kind of like build some of these beautiful things that they wanted to build. And do we want that? Probably not. So I'm at a loss for words. I'm at a loss for words for how difficult all of this stuff is.
Yeah. And that made me think of the whole section on modernism and the different architects that really pushed that style forward. And I got my undergraduate in architecture, and I remember learning about Le Corbusier as this giant of architecture and his beautiful modernist designs. And I felt like in this book, he was the villain, and his ideas on city planning were really not beneficial and not helpful.
You should have gone to planning school, Stephanie. He's definitely the villain in planning school.
Yeah.
No confusion there. I guess it depends which planning school you go to, I'm sure. But
yeah, that was interesting because my master's degree in planning didn't talk about Corbusier at all. I mean, there was a little bit of discussion about Radiant City with Yeah, Corbusier did Radiant City. It was more of like the physical city designs themselves and not the theory behind any of it. That was really kind of troubling. And this idea of these like stacked vertical towers and his original approach of separating it by class, and your towers would be very broken up, and it was this machine for living. And I can't imagine if that had ever really come to fruition, how that would look. I mean, you saw it a little bit in Cabrini Green.
Well, pieces of that, we still have large parts of the country that are, or I should say the continent, that are kind of like a tower in the park model, where his concept was, if you can kind of, this is an engineering problem, is basically how he approached it, right? Is there's too much congestion in the city. And so what we'll do is we'll have these like really great, efficient, well-designed buildings that are going to be tall. And then we're going to have lots of green space, and the green space will fix everything. And we're going to have like we're going to decongest. We're going to have like better connections, transportation between things. So if we can get this running as a well-oiled machine, then, people will be happier. And I think you do still see a lot of that with tower design. And it's in our zoning in a way, like you have to have a certain amount of open space per unit. And depending on the other elements, the parameters of your zoning code, that may translate to a very tall tower with like a big bunch of green around it. I mean, that's the other piece of it, is Peter Hall does get you in their mindset of being like, okay, I disagree with that approach, which I can say with hindsight, but I understand where he was coming from, where he wanted people to have access to green space in the city.
And it was also interesting in this discussion about modernist architecture, it was very driven by technology. And then you start to see that in other earlier movements as well. Technology was going to be what fixed everything. And the Soviet discussion, where he talks about the group there that was doing some more Garden City urbanist designs in the 20s, that the car and electricity is what was going to allow cities to empty out and fix everything. And I think we're seeing that a lot today too, that autonomous vehicles are going to fix everything, or connected smart cities. This will be the thing of the future. This is going to fix everything. And just relying on the technology of the time to be what fixes whatever problem we're facing is kind of an interesting trend, that you think of technology as something that's in today or recent history, not technology as just the invention of the automobile was a technology that had a huge impact on city planning.
Yeah. And it was in that chapter, I remember being shocked at how quickly we can mess things up and how long it takes to try and correct it. Because this book was saying that like even by the 1920s, there was movements to ban cars from cities because there was already too much traffic. In the 1920s, like so quickly it became an issue. And like we're still having that debate in certain places. Some places are still like, everywhere you look, people are like, I don't want cars here, or the traffic is a big problem. We have not solved that in any way. So that just makes me very cautious around a lot of things, where like something can change the city in a very meaningful way very quickly, and we don't really have a backspace on that. There's no way to put the cat in the bag. Back in the bag, is that the phrase?
Yeah. No, that is a really good summary. I think a lot of things have happened very quickly, and then we spend a lot of time trying to fix it. And it goes back to that, because not everyone can agree. Not everyone agrees that car choked downtowns are a bad thing. They're just focused on getting through downtown. And so they don't see the need to reduce lanes or create more walkable areas or add more density in the downtown to support that.
Yeah. And that was emphasized as well in the chapter on highways and the suburbs, and the caution that he was providing the planners, that's a value judgment as well. This value judgment that people must hate living in a certain environment and having a long commute. It's like, well, a lot of people evidently don't. Yeah. So, maybe cool your jets a little bit and don't presume that you speak for everybody.
Yeah, I think that could be one of the bigger lessons from the history of planning that you read through in this book, is just providing options, that it's not just one way that works for everyone, that we have to design and build cities in a way that addresses a number of different lifestyles and preferences.
That seems like a very, I can get behind, I can get behind that takeaway.
We already touched on it a little bit, but the wrap up that I had when I was reading through this was just the evolution of the planning field and the planner. And you really see that threaded throughout the book. In the early years, planners were experts and did blueprint planning and were more top down and morphed into the bottom up community driven approach. And then it was decided in the 70s and 80s during the Great Recession that there was this kind of threat to planning and its legitimacy. And that piece of it was really interesting because in the 70s and 80s, when we didn't have a lot of building, he describes it as everyone was very pro-development, pro-developer, and planners were not to put any restrictions or come up with any ideas. We needed to let the market take hold, and planning really seemed to take a back seat during those years. But then it kind of flipped again as development picked up and there was more opportunity out there that planners could then regulate again and guide growth in a more organized way. And I think we're still in that space, luckily. But there was a quote that I thought was really interesting that the author had. He said, the change can be characterized thus. In 1955, the typical newly graduated planner was at the drawing board producing a diagram of desired land uses. In 1965, she or he was analyzing computer output of traffic patterns in 1975. And the same person was talking late into the night with community groups in an attempt to organize against hostile forces in the outside world.
Well, and I should ask, so what does it look like for you in your day job now?
I feel like we mesh all of that together. So we're very data driven as a profession now. We like to start off with the census data and surveys and get all the information. And then we go out and talk to the community and ask them what they want and what they want to see. And then we go back and do the blueprint drawings and come up with some ideas, go back out to the community, ask them for feedback, and then have our final plan that moves forward. So it seems that we've taken all of the evolution of it and put it into the profession kind of simultaneously.
That kind of feels like this book. It's like all of it in one place, everything in one place all the time, interacting with each other.
Yeah. My kind of recommendation to listeners of the show would be that this is it's a lengthy book. It'll take some time to get through 500 some pages, but I think it's a really important book for planners to read, to understand the history of the profession and what has occurred before, and to use that to inform decisions and actions moving forward.
Yeah, like next to Jane Jacobs, this would probably be my number one recommendation that I've had. I found it so important for me in like having some humility, really. Yeah, I thought it was a great book. I mean, I'm sure if I read it thoroughly again, I would probably find it a different read in this day and age than probably several years ago in terms of the way that we talk about things now. But I found so much of it is just like quotes, direct quotes from people in the past. And it is really, really interesting and helpful to hear the same arguments that you hear today in the words of people decades and decades ago, and just seeing, where this is where that took them. And here's the good that happened from it, and here's the bad that happened from it.
Well, thank you so much for doing this episode with me. I think it's been a fun conversation.
Thank you so much. I mean, it is one of the more interesting requests I've ever had in my life to talk about a book, but it's my pleasure to talk about something that I learned so much from. And it was really, really nice to meet you.